And so there's playing pretend. Well, what Jacob meant was all of you guys sitting up there on stage acting like we have to make a stand against bad doctrine are actually, you're just live action role playing. You're not really doing anything. This is Ben Shapiro would call it kabuki theater. This is just kabuki theater. Apparently, they have their role, which is to be liberals, and we have our role, which is to be conservatives. And let's drum up our support and get our crowd here, and we'll pick sides, and everybody can treat polemics just like fantasy baseball. You have your team, and I have my team, and it's like fantasy baseball because it's very much like. We have MacArthur and who are, you have the next trade. Oh, you want Keller? Okay, so we'll get me. Well, do we have a black guy yet? What do you think, David?
Well, I watched a sermon of his just a couple days ago where I think he rightly pointed to the battle against false doctrine, the battle for the truth in terms of in battle terms. Swords and shields and fighting and the same kind of terminology that the Bible uses. But to say we're going to fight a false idea or a false doctrine and not the people propagating the doctrine is kind of like saying, hey, we're going to go to war against the enemy, but we're not going to tell you who the enemy is. We're going to, it would be like the Allies saying we're going to fight Nazi Germany, but we're not going to identify, hey, here's where this German brigade is over here. This is who we're fighting. It's illogical, and it's kind of sad to see. I'm not entirely sure why Voddie would say something like that.
Which I'm going to do an article about this today, I think. The Voddie goes on to say that the 11th commandment is thou shalt be nice. He's like, I'm breaking the 11th commandment. The 11th commandment says thou shalt be nice. Well, no, that's not the 11th commandment. The 11th commandment is thou shalt not name names. That's the 11th commandment. And guess what? Voddie's still not breaking the 11th commandment. So this is why it's LARPing, because, Voddie and all he's an impressive specimen. Voddie is sitting there saying, I ain't no coward. I'm not going to be forced to follow the 11th commandment. Screw the 11th commandment. That's a bad commandment. God didn't give us the 11th commandment. It says to be nice. No, the 11th commandment says not to name names, and you just got done saying you're not going to name names. Voddie, you're not as brave as you're acting. Voddie's not as brave as he's acting. He's still and I love Voddie, but in this setting with Founders Ministry, which does the same job discernment ministers do, except 5 years later, Founders is awful as a ministry. Like, it's awful. They don't lead the way. Founders is always following discernment bloggers wherever they go. Voddie's not as courageous here as I think that he perhaps thinks he is, or he's projecting himself to be. The 11th commandment is to name names. Name some freaking names. We need to know. Because when you have people saying Russell Moore is a conservative, Albert Mohler's a conservative, right? When they hear us talk about liberals, critical race theorists, all right, and so forth, cultural Marxists, their fans are nodding with us in agreement. And their fans are going, that's right, liberalism's bad. Says everybody listening to the briefing. Liberalism's bad. Cultural Marxism is bad. Critical race theory is bad. I love the briefing, right? They're in agreement with you, but you need to stop and go, hold on a second. Albert Mohler is the one doing it. Albert Mohler is the one promoting Matthew Hall. Albert Mohler is the one who's promoting Dr. Haken. Albert Mohler is the one who's promoting Russell Moore. Albert Mohler is the one who's promoting Karen Swallow Prior. Albert Mohler is the one who's promoting Danny Aiken. Albert Mohler is the one who's pushing Jarvis Williams, all right? That's Albert Mohler's guilty of it. If you're not doing that, you still have the Mohlerites in Voddie's audience going, yeah, liberalism's bad, critical race theory is bad, because they need to have somebody put 2 and 2 together for them. And Voddie goes on to say, he says, speaking of those of us who make war with people, quote, they make it personal. He's deriding discernment bloggers. Voddie says they make it personal. They're mean, nasty, obnoxious. The gospel is offensive enough. It doesn't need your help. And he said that at a conference that is ostensibly the leading organization standing against wokeism in the Southern Baptist Convention. This is an implicit criticism of discernment bloggers. Voddie is.
Well, the funny thing is that the
Go ahead.
Scripture makes it personal. I would argue Scripture makes it personal. And one of the things that I think is a blind spot for Voddie right now, is that 2 Peter 2:1 talks about false prophets. It's not talking about false ideologies, even though, of course, false prophets bring false theology. They bring false doctrine. False prophets appeared among the people, just as there will also be false teachers among you who, and this is the catch, I think, and I would be curious as to see what Voddie really says about this, who will secretly introduce destructive heresies. So this is not ideology that will be necessarily out in the open.
Right.
And this is the camp that I would put guys like Al Mohler into, who are saying one thing and doing another. They are secretly introducing these things.
Right.
And so when you have false theology, false ideology being secretly introduced, the way that you shepherd your other Christians, your congregation, the people that people in Voddie's church that he is the under shepherd for, you have to call the people out by name. That's part of your job. You need to expose these false teachers.
Speaking of false prophets and false healers, Luke did not hesitate to name the name of Simon, who had tried to solicit the apostles with a bribe. They pointed him out. Maybe he'll do that again, and people need to know who they are. I think it's interesting that Voddie makes some jabs at discernment bloggers even more harshly than he does towards those teaching falsely. I mean, what he said about discernment bloggers is significantly harsher than what he said about the seminary president he was referencing. And here's the difference.
And discernment blogging is supposed to jostle your heart, I mean,
here's the difference between Tom Ascol and J.D. Hall. Tom Ascol says what J.D. Hall says 5 years later. That's the only difference. And because I say it first, then you're accused of being a slanderer of the brethren, because you're the first one to say it. No one's heard that before. They're not prone to research. They're just like, well, you're such a jerk. Well, now by the time Ascol says it, and Ascol's never out in front. He always waits for other people to be out in front of him, because he's a weak little man. Tom Ascol is, and he wants others to take the brunt of it first, and then he'll come in and play cleanup and act as though he's been at the front the whole time. They're equivocating between discerners and the people that need to be discerned, as though they're the same kind of evil, or they're both bad in the same way. There's no comparison. And by the way, I'm tired of watching Tom Ascol and Voddie Baucham and all those guys plagiarize my words. And yeah, I'm going to use the P word, plagiarize my words. I can show you articles at Founders, which are almost direct quotations from articles I wrote at Pulpit and Pen 5 years ago. They have the same hyperlinks in the same order. So somebody took a Pulpit and Pen article, and they just rewrote it with the same links, same paragraphs, same sentences of the same point, but just a few words changed around. I'm tired of being plagiarized by these evangelical leaders, only then to be attacked for having said it long before they did. I'm a little fed up with that. And so
go ahead. The funny thing is, sorry to jump. So the funny thing for me was and I guess, I don't know if I want to call it a sermon or a presentation, whatever, where Voddie said these things. Ironically, it's horribly ironic. He calls out millennials for being snowflakes about how people say things. So he calls out millennials and say, hey, you millennials are more concerned about the language or the harshness or the unloving way that the preacher called out these false doctrines than you are about the false doctrines. It's horribly ironic, because he's criticizing that standard correctly, and then yet using that standard
exactly right
ostensibly against discernment blockers.
We can't fight snowflake culture. We can't fight snowflake culture while engaging in snowflake culture. We can't do it. Does Voddie need a safe space from the discernment bloggers? Voddie, you need some grape juice in the corner where it's quiet. Nobody's going to offend you today, Voddie.
Yeah.
Don't be upset now.
He doesn't. He just needs to take that next step. He needs to put that next piece of the puzzle in place.
Voddie's tough, man. He's tough as nails. So why apply that standard to what we're doing? Like, do you need to be offended endlessly and easily by discernment bloggers? Are you triggered? Should I give a trigger warning the next time I name Albert Mohler's name? It's time to take the binky out of your mouth, grow up, and realize this is how we discuss subjects. You don't like it when the millennials at the university are playing this game. I don't know why Voddie Baucham's playing this game.